Nothing in our landscape is here by accident. It's all part of the incredible story of how people have shaped our country over thousands of years. Every ridge, every bump has a meaning.
I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, it's my job to unpick the great story we've inherited. From my perspective, the best way to do that is up here in the air.
Aerial photography is challenging our views of some of our most iconic landscapes. I'm flying along the River Thames to discover a part of our military history that's been lost in just a few generations. Is it possible that experimental research carried out here helped to change the course of the First World War? The history of the Thames and the history of the defence of Britain are intertwined, yet there's one important part of that story that's been largely overlooked. It all took place in an area many people have never even heard of.
We're just flying over the Dartford crossing. We've got Essex on my left, we've got Kent on my right, but we're heading to somewhere that I'm really interested in, the Hoo Peninsula, down this way.
The Hoo sits on the Kent coast, flanked by the Thames to its north and the River Medway to its south. Over the past 150 years, this place has played a major role in British military history. It seems incredible, yet many of the stories of the breakthroughs that happened here have been forgotten. Until now, we've been missing a key chapter in the history of the First World War.
For while decisions of state were being made miles upstream at Westminster, it was here, in what Dickens described as the wild, flat marshes, that the dirty, gritty, industrial nature of modern warfare was being forged.
Much of the work done here was top secret. Very few records were kept. Archaeologists at English Heritage have been carrying out the first ever survey of the whole peninsula, recording every lump of concrete, every mound from the air. So now we can begin to piece together the untold story of exactly what went on here on the Hoo.
And I want to uncover those secrets, find out how people lived, worked, sometimes died here, right here on the home front.
It doesn't take long to see this area has a rich military past. The lower reaches of the Thames are punctuated by a defensive ring of coastal forts going back centuries. They were built to repel any attacker heading upriver to the capital. Some were still in use during the First World War. Today, many are abandoned and decaying, so it's a race against time to research and record them. The best way to see them in context is from the air.
From here, you can see how the whole network of forts fits together. They're really quite close from the air. It's difficult to imagine how a ship could get between them without being hit.
From the aerial survey, it was immediately clear that Cliff Fort, on the Thames shoreline of the Hoo, is at particular risk. It also has some unusual features. Archaeologists are now investigating it fully for the first time. Peter Kendall from English Heritage is one of those carrying out the work.
It was built in the middle of the 19th century as a result of a royal commission that was called by Lord Palmerston. And it was built because there was a genuine belief that the French would possibly come and invade us.
How genuine was that, though? I mean, the French, we ruled the waves.
Well, we did, but the French Navy had new iron warships, steam-powered, with better guns, and there was a genuine belief that the British Navy might be beaten.
So this is about a massive deterrent. It's shock and awe stuff.
It is. It's built to resist defence, but it's also built to deter an invader. Come and have a go if you're hard enough.
Cliff was equivalent to our nuclear deterrent today, but deterrents can become obsolete incredibly quickly. Once state-of-the-art, Cliff Fort is now being attacked, but the invader is not a foreign power. It's the sea, which is slowly engulfing it.
And where are we going now, Peter?
We're going inside through the one and only entrance to the fort.
Right, and why do we need these?
You'll find out in a minute. Just mind your head as we go through.
Good grief. I didn't expect a fortified swamp. I mean, it is like exploring some sort of jungle temple, isn't it?
very much so.
Only by wading across the flooded parade ground can we get a good look at the abandoned gun emplacements, which were once so vital to the nation's defence.
So what sort of gun would we have had in here?
It would be an enormous gun filling this entire space. It's known as a rifle muzzle loader, which means that everything that it fired had to be loaded down the muzzle end, not the breech end.
That
where we're
sounds quite antiquated. I mean, middle of the 19th century, everything's getting a bit more industrialised.
We're right on the eve, though, of major changes in artillery. By the time this fort is completely built and armed with its guns, it's in fact obsolete. And so by the time you get to the First World War, which isn't that many decades away from when this fort was first built, all its guns have actually been moved up to the top of the rampart, and these floors would have been empty.
Photos clearly show where the circular gun emplacements would have been, but they also reveal what looks like a snip in the shoreline. The research has shown that this is in fact the unique remains of a military experiment, a world first that helped cement the WHO's reputation for innovation.
So it looks like some sort of slipway.
Well, that's indeed what it is, but it's more complicated and exciting than that. This is a Brennan torpedo launch rail. So you can see there's this, like iron railway tracks, running down from the fort and down and into the river. And down this was launched a wire-guided torpedo.
Wire-guided?
And this is cutting-edge technology. This is the world's first operational wire-guided torpedo.
A guided weapon system right
That's
here
right.
on the Thames.
Yep.
So the idea is you're attacking shipping out here. There's some sort of sighting mechanism?
That's right. An observation post inside the fort. When it observed that the enemy was in the river, they would launch the torpedo down this rail, slides down the rail under its own weight, hits the water, and then its propulsion mechanism kicks in.
Well, certainly large enough targets going by. Presumably it was never used in anger.
Never in anger, but it has got the record of having this station of having sunk a ship. Just as you can see, there's a large commercial ship coming up the Thames now. In 1901, a small coastal ketch was doing the same, and this torpedo station was carrying out trials and launched its torpedo, and horror of horrors, struck and sank the ship, a British ship.
Oh, the form filling. And was anyone hurt?
No, thankfully the captain and his family were able to abandon ship, and they were rescued, and indeed the boat was later refloated.
And at least it proved the principle worked. These things, if they'd had to be used in anger, would have been effective.
It was a hell of a way to do so, but yes, it showed that this was a workable system.
Developed in the 1890s, the Brennan torpedo is a great example of the WHO Peninsula's groundbreaking past. But like many of the historic remains here, it's vulnerable. The structure is already being washed away by the sea, so recording it is a priority. But the sea isn't the only threat to the WHO. There are also proposals for a new London airport and major housing developments, one of them on this site where the Chattenden Barracks once stood. And in the fields nearby, something very interesting has been discovered.
It might just look like a piece of green hillside today, but this is a piece of landscape that's actually posing all sorts of questions for the archaeology. Under the right conditions, there's a whole load of different shapes, twists and turns. Something has been excavated in that field.
Until the survey, no one knew there was anything in these fields. Now there's a theory they were used for experimenting with trench warfare during the First World War. I'm going to try and confirm that.
This hillside is a classic example of why aerial photography is so important in finding traces of the past. There are a few vague hints of something going on here, but you can't make any sense of it at all on the ground. The photographs, though, tell a completely different story. What these have shown is an extensive network of trenches covering more than 200 acres. But what's surprising is the sheer variety of trench patterns. There's a chance that this area was being used not just to practice trench digging, but to explore different types of trench design.
World War I got bogged down in trench warfare because of technological advances such as the machine gun. Traditional tactics like cavalry charges were now suicidal. Neither side could advance, so they dug in. It was a new type of warfare. The general view today is that troops were thrown into battle with very little preparation and training. But if we can prove the army was using these trenches to experiment with trench design and train soldiers, we will have to rethink that. These reconstructed First World War trenches in Suffolk give an idea of what Chattenden might have looked like during the war.
Just two of us getting out of the way. You wouldn't want to step up there because your head's exposed, all that sort of thing. So.
Martin Brown has studied trenches on the battlefront, but it's the first time he's seen photos of Chattenden. I also want him to look at a map of the area from 1915. The date turns out to be very significant.
It says here, New Field Works Ground, coloured pink. Well, that's this area here. And that's precisely the area where these vague crop marks are showing up. Now, new field works, that suggests to me field works, entrenchments, excavations.
Yeah. The Manual of Field Works, that's what it's called. It's interesting, the date, you know, September 15, just a year after the war started. And it's the new Field Works Ground. What have they had to do? They've had to expand training, so there's a lot more people coming in, they need more space. But the other thing that's really important there is it's gone from a war where they knew they were going to be doing bits of trenching, just for, you know, temporary position and cover and that sort of thing, to by that period, by September 1915, you are into full-on trench warfare with, you know, that front that stretches all the way from Belgium down to Switzerland and is defended every inch of the way.
We know that the army soon discovered that long straight trenches were vulnerable to attack and could be quickly overcome. By developing different designs, such as a Greek key-like pattern of fire bays and traverses, the trenches were much easier to hold. Any enemy had to work its way through the zigzag. Every twist and turn could be defended.
Is this more than just practice? Is this about experimentation, working out what works best?
Yes, if you're going to see evidence of that anywhere, it will be here on the engineers' training ground, because they're the ones who are developing best practice. They're taking intelligence reports and letters coming back from the front, particularly in that sort of first few months, and distilling it down into things that work, things that don't work, where you do and don't want to put your trenches, that sort of thing. You'll get some...
And from aerial photos, Martin can link trenches he's seen on the Western Front with our trenches at Chattenden. So we've now got proof this really was a place where trench design was being drawn up.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we saw at Plug Street in Belgium, where we've been working. And there's a sunken lane, and Christmas 14, British troops are in there. But then what they do is they push forward into the field with some saps, and then they join them up with a traversed firing line, exactly as you can see being practiced here.
This is really interesting because we didn't know about this area of Chattenden before. We didn't know about the trenches that they were building. It was just that area shaded pink on the map. Very little documentary evidence for it. But now we have this direct link to the Western Front.
There is a strand of history about the First World War that tells you that men were thrown away and they were thrown into action untrained and all of this stuff. And actually you've got the solid archaeological evidence here on the ground in Britain and on the battlefields that, nope, actually we took it really seriously and training was paramount.
What's fascinating is that the aerial photographs have illuminated part of our history which was almost forgotten. They weren't just practicing trench building at Chattenden, they were experimenting. They were trying to create new ways to keep the soldiers as safe as possible, as effective as possible. It was a whole new way of doing warfare, and it was invented there on those fields at Chattenden. But being in these trenches, this is really sobering because you realise that this isn't about crop marks, it's not about marks in the field. These represent people's lives, their work and their deaths.
And it wasn't only on the Western Front people were dying. Throughout the First World War, people also sacrificed their lives here on the peninsula as the industrial nature of modern warfare made its impact.
That's one of the most extraordinary pieces of landscape I've ever seen. It looks like something out of a film set. There are fragments of buildings, regular lines, earthworks. There's a very definite plan to it all. It's an intriguing sight.
Because much of the work undertaken on the Who during the First World War was top secret, very few photographs were ever taken. So it's the aerial survey which is showing us how these buildings relate to each other.
There's rows of roofless buildings, and then there's earthwork revetments in regular pattern. But the earthworks have a very, very regular appearance. There's a big plan, a grand design behind all of this.
What an amazing place. We've got the shells of ruined buildings all around. There are great earthwork mounds and these enigmatic lumps of concrete sprouting out of the ground. This place was obviously so important once, but now it's entirely abandoned.
This whole area is in fact the remains of a massive explosives factory. Research by English Heritage is revealing exactly what and how things were manufactured here.
What an extraordinary landscape this is. I mean, you really feel as though you're coming somewhere secretive and out of the way.
Yeah, and there's a reason why this is such a remote location. It's because this site was used for the manufacture and storage of incredibly dangerous and incredibly explosive materials. So you needed somewhere that was far away from people, where people lived, but also as well, it's close to the river so that they could take things in and out.
The Cliff Explosives Works began life back in the 1890s when it was used for storing gunpowder. With the coming of the First World War, the site underwent a huge expansion.
What we're looking at here are layers of different buildings built at different times. There were explosions, parts of the site were destroyed, so they rebuilt them. So we're looking at a very, very complex layout of material here, whereas further over, in the First World War, there's a very, very different layout. You see how it's very regular, and we can see that was laid out all in virtually one phase as part of that First World War expansion. All these mounds are, again, protecting the rest of the site from the possible blasts that could have happened from the very dangerous processes that were going on within them.
And it's such a vast complex. It's really difficult to get a handle on it down here on the ground. The aerial view gave you that overview of the whole site.
It does, and it's certainly on the aerial view you can really see the difference in the layout. And also, of course, we've got historic aerial photographs, so we can see what was happening on this site, because this piece of land was used for demolitions disposals, for example.
That's so important. So it's not just the aerial view today, it's those historic aerial views that are helping to reveal the sort of layers of development in this site.
Yeah.
I can't imagine arriving on this site on the ground. How would you begin to survey it if you didn't have the overview?
It's early days, but we're beginning to get an idea of how the site developed from simple storage into an extensive armaments factory during the First World War.
This represents the massive expansion in the production of cordite, which was used as a propellant in firearms, so everything from rifles right the way up to the big guns that they had on the battleships during the First World War.
So all those shells that are being fired off from the great naval battles like Jutland, they're being made here?
Well, it's the cordite, it's the propellant that makes the shells go that's manufactured here.
The research at the site is also revealing stories about the people who worked here. Among them was Amanda Thomas's grandmother, Minnie Rogers.
What did she do here?
Well, it's unclear exactly. She didn't talk about it that much, and sadly she died before I was born. But I think it was probably something to do with the cordite, and possibly from reports that I've read of what other young women were doing at the time, perhaps packing the cordite.
So a job, perhaps for the first time, earning money, a bit of independence, but at what a price. I mean, they must have known it was dangerous work.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In fact, the work was so dangerous that 21 people died at Cliff, including a workman known to Amanda's grandmother.
It really was quite awful what happened to him.
How did he die?
Well, he was scraping the corrugated iron wall of one of the workshops, and he was scraping with a metal chisel, and the metal chisel caught on the corrugated iron, caused a spark, and caused an explosion with the nitroglycerine that was nearby to where he was scraping, and he was blown out of the building and ended up flayed in a tree. That's how powerful and how dangerous the explosives were that they were dealing with here on a day-to-day basis.
Actually, the Hoo Peninsula really demonstrates the power of aerial archaeology. It's difficult to make sense of these odd lumps of concrete from the ground, but from the air, patterns start to emerge, like the explosives factory. All of this is telling a story. It's a story of great scientific endeavour, but also of great tragedy.
We've seen how innovation on the Who began with the forts and progressed rapidly from developing trench warfare to creating explosives for our warships. And we're still making new discoveries.
The Who coastline is fascinating. It's littered with wrecks and old jetties. And down there, it looks like there's an old submarine. But there's one particular site that's causing a lot of excitement, and that's where I'm off to now. This is Kingsnorth Power Station. Back in World War I, this landscape looked totally different. It's only the historic aerial photographs that have captured what was going on here in those days.
This photograph was taken years before the power stations were built. On it is the unmistakable shape of two colossal hangars, because this is where in World War I the Royal Navy designed, tested and built their airships.
Zeppelins were already demonstrating how effectively airships could be used for bombing. We know that here on the peninsula they were being developed for anti-submarine warfare and reconnaissance. It was at Kingsnorth they were put through their paces. But the airship hangars were dismantled decades ago. What we don't know is if any of the other buildings from the airship days survive. I'm going to see if the early photos can help me find any.
This is astounding. I've just come onto the industrial estate looking for fragments of the Royal Naval Air Service station that was here, and there are these gigantic buildings, and I mean they do look like the buildings. They are definitely the buildings that are on these photographs. These are early photographs. One of the hangars is still in place here, and that would be just over in that direction where the power station is now. Massive hangars. Well, this is extraordinary. I mean, they are the types of buildings that I would expect to be constructed in sort of 1915, 1916, 17. I think they're here to service the airships. They're not the hangars, but engineering activities that went alongside them. And this is fascinating. They don't survive in many places, these buildings. They're usually swept away.
The trouble I've got is that the only photos I have were taken in the 1920s and 30s, so I can't prove these are First World War buildings, even though my hunch is that they are.
They do look like airship buildings. They're magnificent buildings, actually, and what a surprise. Unbelievable.
But one surviving building has definite links to what was once a top-secret base. Just a few miles from Kingsnorth, a strangely shaped barn can be seen from the air. It turns out a local farmer salvaged the timber frame roof from one of the hangars. We know it's originally from Kingsnorth because distinctive Admiralty marks survive on the wooden trusses. It's so rare that the 215-foot-long building is now protected.
This is not your normal farm barn, is it? No. It's just splendid. Those sort of cartwheel-like roof trusses there.
That one's still quite...
Tina Bilbay has a particular interest in the barn. Her grandfather used to work at the airship station.
This building, this would have been familiar to your grandfather?
Yes. This would have been where he was working, one of the buildings he was working in, because he was producing hydrogen and filling the airships.
And that was a dangerous thing to do?
Very, very. His wages actually reflect that. When he was put in as a hydrogen worker, his wages were much more than just an ordinary air mechanic.
So he got danger money?
Danger money, yes, yeah. Indeed. Well, it's flammable, it's explosive, and there were fatalities.
People were obviously dying in their thousands at the front, but I think we sometimes forget the human cost of work here on the home front. The people working with dangerous materials, munitions, experimental materials, dangerous gases, things like that. They were exposed to quite a lot of danger too.
Well, yes. My grandfather died in his mid-40s from lung troubles, and presumably it was the hydrogen gas that he'd got a lungful of, or probably more than one lungful of.
Over a long period of time.
Over the 2 years that he was working here.
Tina has a photo of her grandfather and the Kingsnorth workers, which was taken at the end of the war. This might give me the proof I've been looking for that those buildings I saw earlier are indeed from World War I.
So they're all standing here. The photograph was taken at that point. I can see the end of the hangar, so they're definitely between the two, but it's definitely that one I'm interested in. That's the roof of it right there. Yeah, the gable end, and I can just see the roof line of the building behind it. And there's the water tower behind. Well, that's incredible. So it's definitely a building of that era.
What's clear from all the locations I've flown over on the Hoo Peninsula is how dramatic the pace of change has been. Just a few short decades and the experimental and revolutionary becomes old hat. And nowhere demonstrates how military technology advanced more than my final destination.
We began the story at Cliff Fort, and when it was built at the end of the 19th century, it was state-of-the-art. Brennan torpedo, big guns. It was designed to protect us from attack from the sea. Just a few decades later, Cliff was redundant. The threat now came from the air, and this was the answer.
Because it lies in the middle of an army training ground, this small collection of buildings had lain in obscurity until the aerial survey.
This is a very well laid out site. Over here we've got the barracks, and this is the munitions store and officers' quarters. And over there is the war shelter. They would have got in there if they were under attack.
It was thought it could be a Second World War anti-aircraft battery, but further investigation has revealed it's far earlier than that and dates from the First World War. Its role to defend against German bombers and Zeppelins, and it has a unique place in military history.
This is Britain's first purpose-built anti-aircraft gun emplacement. There's a thick concrete wall around the outside, and the holdfast where the gun was sited is right here. We've got the Thames estuary, we've got Cliff over there, the munitions factory, Kingsnorth, the power station, the airship station was just over there. We've got a big naval ordnance depot just over the hill. All these places had to be protected, and this was the spot to do it from.
Discoveries being made on the Hoo are changing our perceptions of the First World War. We're realising that research and innovation at home was every bit as vital to the success of the war as the battles on the Western Front.
There was a time when people thought of the Hoo Peninsula as a forgotten backwater, but we've discovered that this place was at the centre of military technology. Experiments in trench design, airship construction, innovation in explosives all took place here, and they had a profound effect on the course of World War I. Now, this is a place that's embraced change, and it's facing change again. But let's hope that this change doesn't erase the traces of its heritage. The Hoo really is a very, very special place.
Try something new in 2022. Listen to This Classical Life at 12:30, the music of video gaming and mixtapes with Jess Gillam and guests on BBC Sounds in half an hour.